Theresa May has warned that it would be an unforgivable breach of trust in democracy if MPs reject her Brexit deal on Tuesday. Government plans to scrap jail sentences of less than 6 months have been welcomed by prison reform groups, but the Probation Officers Union says they won't work without more money. President Trump has angrily dismissed allegations that the FBI investigated whether he was secretly working for Russia. The South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, has urged men to unite against what he called a major crisis of rape and sexual assault in the country. And in sport, Liverpool have extended their lead at the top of the Premier League. The Prime Minister has warned MPs preparing to vote on her EU withdrawal deal that a failure to deliver Brexit would be a catastrophic and unforgivable breach of trust in our democracy. Writing in the Sunday Express, Theresa May said Parliament cannot and must not let people down. But Downing Street is alarmed at the prospect of losing control of business in the Commons and so potentially of Brexit itself if, as expected, Mrs May loses the crucial vote on Tuesday. Our political correspondent Chris Mason reports.
We stand at the start of a momentous week at Westminster. The government is just a few days away from a widely expected defeat over its Brexit plan. The vote, the Prime Minister writes, is the biggest and most important decision that any MP of our generation will be asked to make. Theresa May adds, we will risk not leaving the European Union at all, desperately pleading with her colleagues to back her deeply unpopular deal. And the stakes, already towering, have grown higher. The Sunday Times reveals the government fears losing its ability to govern in the event of defeat on Tuesday. Its advisers have warned that backbenchers could seize control of parliamentary business and so, for instance, legally compel the government to delay Brexit. No one can be certain what is going to happen next. Rarely in recent times has there been such uncertainty about the country and the government's future.
2 separate campaign rallies have taken place, putting forward different visions of how Britain can break the political stalemate over Brexit. Leading Remain supporters were among the speakers in Sheffield, calling for a second referendum, while left-wing activists held a march in London demanding a general election. Here's our political correspondent Tom Barton.
When MPs vote on Tuesday, the likelihood of Theresa May's Brexit deal being approved is slim. And so, today, 2 different protests with 2 different answers to what should happen next. In Sheffield, the People's Vote campaign held a rally to call for another referendum. Speakers from Labour, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats shared a platform. Lib Dem leader Vince Cable told the crowd the campaign was close to victory because there had been a cross-party approach.
This is a horribly divided country. Brexit has split us in different ways. And when we've finished, when we've won, we've got to bind the country together. And that's where this process, the working together, has got to continue. It's so important.
In London, the left-wing group The People's Assembly held a separate protest.
What do we want? General election! When do we want it? Now!
The focus was on how Tuesday's vote could be used to force a general election. Among the Labour figures who attended was the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell.
This isn't just about Brexit, this is about austerity as well. That's why so many people were marching today. But also we're seeing a government literally disintegrate in front of our eyes. Legislation it can't get through, even its own Finance Act it had to amend as a result of having to capitulate to the opposition at time and time again. So we're seeing a government in office but not in power, and it's time therefore to have a general election.
The Transport Secretary Chris Grayling warned today that a Brexit that failed to deliver on promises to end free movement and leave the single market would open the door to extremist, populist political forces. The chances of a general election or another referendum may become clearer after MPs vote on Tuesday night.
The chairman of the Commons International Trade Committee has raised concerns about Britain's post-Brexit agreements with Switzerland and up to 70 non-EU countries. The SNP MP Angus MacNeil said the most basic questions about the future of the UK's relationships remained unanswered, and he asked the International Trade Secretary Liam Fox for clarification. Our business correspondent Joe Miller reports.
Member states of the European Union don't just benefit from trading freely among themselves. Over the years, Brussels has negotiated almost 40 agreements with dozens of countries around the world, including Mexico and South Korea, to bring down tariffs and reduce regulatory barriers. Last year, Dr. Fox told the BBC that he hoped the UK would replicate all of those agreements after Brexit, and that 70 countries had already agreed to do so in principle. In December, his department said the first of those deals with Switzerland had been approved, but the chairman of the International Trade Committee, Angus MacNeil, said there had been no clarity on the terms of the accord, and even raised the prospect of the free movement of people, currently a condition of the EU-Swiss deal, being adopted by the UK. Mr MacNeil added that Britain was running out of time to adopt the 39 or so pending agreements, which all have to pass through Parliament. In response, the government said the arrangement with Switzerland replicated the current one as far as possible, and more details are expected to be forthcoming.
The trade union that represents probation officers has welcomed government proposals to abolish most prison sentences of 6 months or less in England and Wales, but said they won't work unless they're given more resources. The Ministry of Justice says it's considering the change because short jail terms are less effective at cutting reoffending than community penalties. Our correspondent Catherine Stancheshin reports.
The Prisons Minister, Rory Stewart, made it clear when he took over the job that reducing the number of short-term jail sentences handed out by the courts was a priority. The prison population in England and Wales has doubled since the 1990s and now stands at more than 80,000. 2/3 of inmates serving sentences of less than a year reoffend within 12 months. Mr Stewart said the use of what he called good community sentences would prevent those with chaotic lifestyles entering a cycle of criminality, easing the burden on prisons in the process. It's a view shared by some campaign groups who've welcomed the idea. Frances Crook is the chief executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform.
We do not want overcrowded prisons. We do not want fetid prisons that actually make crime worse, because the majority of people who come out of prison commit more crimes. That's a failure for everybody. It's a failure for victims, it's a failure for the taxpayer, and it's a failure for those individual people too. This is a sensible policy and the Howard League welcomes it.
Under these proposals, sentences of less than 6 months would no longer be given other than in the case of violent crime or sexual offences. A similar scheme is already operating in Scotland, where reoffending rates have dropped to their lowest point in 19 years. But there are concerns it amounts to being soft on crime. Others feel there must be more resources available for other forms of rehabilitation in order to make this approach work. Ian Lawrence is General Secretary of NAPO, a trade union for the probation service.
The service was split into two 4 years ago. It has been a disaster, and we need investment now to repair that damage. So we're in a position to accommodate the extra thousands of people who it is intended will be out into our streets. And we welcome that, and we want to work with the ministers on that, but we must have urgent resources invested into the service now.
The Ministry of Justice said short sentences were too often ineffective, but at the moment this was simply an option under consideration.
President Trump has dismissed a report that the FBI began an investigation into whether he was working secretly for Russia. The New York Times suggested the Bureau acted after Mr Trump sacked its former director, James Comey. Our Washington correspondent David Willis reports.
According to the New York Times, FBI officials became suspicious of Donald Trump's ties to Russia during his 2016 campaign for the presidency. His refusal to criticize Moscow and his call for the Russians to hack into the emails of his opponent Hillary Clinton piqued their curiosity, but it wasn't until May of 2017, when the president sacked the FBI director James Comey, that the organization actively began to investigate whether he was working for Russia, be it knowingly or unwittingly, and whether his actions posed a threat to national security. But days after it began, a special counsel, Robert Mueller, was appointed to look into allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election, and the investigation was rolled into his inquiry. Mr Mueller has yet to release his findings, but the New York Times report says a vigorous debate has since taken shape amongst former law enforcement officials over whether the FBI overreacted. In response to the paper's report, Mr. Trump expressed incredulity that the FBI acted, as he put it, without reason or proof in investigating him. He also claimed that he had been far tougher on Russia than his presidential predecessors, and once again branded the Mueller inquiry a witch hunt.
3 people, 2 firefighters and a Spanish woman, have died in a huge explosion in central Paris caused by a gas leak. Dozens of people were injured, 10 of them seriously. The blast occurred near the Paris Opera, a popular tourist area. Tom Singleton reports.
The explosion happened this morning as firefighters were looking for a gas leak. This recording was made shortly afterwards by an onlooker as flames and smoke spewed from the building. The force of the blast overturned cars, blew out shop fronts and covered the streets with broken glass. People in nearby apartments described their windows shattering and doors being wrenched from their hinges. Dozens of tourists, some with suitcases in hand, were evacuated. This man, Pedro, was working in a hotel opposite the building where the blast happened.
When I walked through the door, I heard a huge explosion. The force of the blast was very strong, showering me with pieces of glass and bits of ceiling. There was a lot of blood on my neck and on my head too. I couldn't breathe because of the black smoke. So I covered my face, and luckily I know my way around the hotel, so eventually I located the exit.
Police officers blocked off several streets in the area, allowing helicopters to land and ferry the injured to hospital. 200 firefighters were called to the scene. The Interior Minister, Christophe Castanet, said the number of dead would have been higher if it hadn't been for their bravery. He said they had taken very large risks to save lives, including those of their colleagues, some of whom were buried under the rubble for 2.5 hours.
The French government says 84,000 people took part in so-called Yellow Vest protests today, the 9th occasion they've taken to the streets. The figure last week was 50,000. Nearly 250 people were detained, but no serious incidents have been reported. The President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, says his country is facing what he calls a major crisis of rape and sexual assault, and he's urged men to unite against it. He made his impassioned plea when he launched an election manifesto for the governing ANC in Durban. From Johannesburg, our correspondent Andrew Harding sent this report.
A vast crowd of ANC supporters gathered at the stadium in Durban, expecting to hear the governing party explain how it plans to win this year's national elections. They got that, but it wasn't the highlight. This was.
I want to call on the men of our country, the men who are here today, to please stand up on your feet right now.
President Cyril Ramaphosa said South Africa was facing a national crisis, not the stagnant economy, not rampant corruption, but violence against women.
Everyone who is a man, let us stand up and make a clear commitment. We will end gender-based violence.
40,000 rapes are reported here every year, almost certainly a fraction of the real total. President Ramaphosa said it was time to make that history. Overall, his speech sought to mark a clear break with a decade of drift and misrule under his predecessor Jacob Zuma. Cyril Ramaphosa promised competence and honesty, barely addressing populist issues like land reform and focusing instead on ways to tackle rural poverty and the world's highest rate of youth unemployment.
A Saudi teenager who fled from her family, fearing that they would kill her for renouncing Islam, has arrived in Canada, where she's been offered asylum. Rahaf al-Qunun, who's 18, barricaded herself in a hotel room in Bangkok and used social media to highlight her case. Nada Tawfiq reports from Toronto.
Rahaf al-Qunun arrived with a smile on her face. She wore a grey hooded sweatshirt with the word Canada on it and a bright blue cap with the UN Refugee Agency's logo. She was escorted out in front of waiting news cameras by Canada's Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland, who introduced her as a brave new Canadian. The Saudi teenager waved but did not speak to the media. Instead, Ms. Freeland spoke on her behalf.
She wanted Canadians to see that she's here, that she's well, and that she's very, very happy to be in her new home, although she did comment to me about the cold.
Earlier, she tweeted pictures aboard her flight before takeoff with the message, "I did it." A few days ago, the teenager had tried to reach Australia by way of Thailand when her passport was confiscated and she was told she would be deported. She said she had feared her family would kill her for renouncing Islam. Her story attracted global attention after she barricaded herself in her hotel room and took to Twitter to plead for help from Western countries and the United Nations Refugee Agency. Saudi Arabia and Canada have been on bad terms ever since Ottawa criticized Riyadh's arrest of women's rights activists in August. Rahaf al-Qunun's case is likely to exacerbate the already tense relations between the two countries.
The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said he's optimistic the US and Turkey can agree on a way to protect America's Kurdish allies in Syria after its troops leave the country. President Trump's unexpected announcement just before Christmas that the US was pulling out of Syria has raised fears Turkey will mount a full-scale attack on the Kurds. Mr. Pompeo is on a Middle East tour intended to reassure Washington's allies. Barbara Plett-Usher reports.
Mr. Pompeo told journalists an agreement was a work in progress after he'd spoken by telephone with his Turkish counterpart. He offered no details, but he said he was optimistic the two sides could find a way for the Turks to defend their country from legitimate terror threats and at the same time protect the Kurdish militias fighting alongside the Americans against the Islamic State group. The Turks have not confirmed this assessment. Publicly, they continue to insist they're determined to fight the Kurdish rebels, whom they regard as terrorists. Mr. Pompeo also downplayed the impact of withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria. He called it a tactical change that didn't substantially alter America's ability to carry out necessary military actions.
The American bishop, whose sermon at the wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle made headline news around the world, has launched an investigation into a senior member of his clergy over the issue of same-sex marriage. Michael Curry, the presiding bishop of the US Episcopal Church, which is part of the global Anglican Communion, has taken the action against the Bishop of Albany in New York State. John McManus reports.
In 2015, the Episcopal Church in the United States defied warnings from the wider Anglican Communion and voted to permit gay couples to marry in church, although it allowed clergy to opt out if they wished. Last year, it went one step further, telling those bishops still opposed to same-sex marriage that they now had to permit the ceremony in their own diocese, drafting in sympathetic clergy from elsewhere if necessary. One bishop, though, William Love from Albany in New York State, objected, saying the new rule did not reflect God's intent for the sacrament of marriage. Bishop Love went on to say that the Church, which was the first in the Anglican Communion to consecrate an openly gay, non-celibate bishop, had been hijacked by the gay rights agenda. The Church will now conduct a preliminary investigation, and in the meantime, the head of the Church, Michael Curry, has ordered the Albany bishop not to discipline any of his clergy who marry gay couples. The Episcopalians have been riven over attitudes to same-sex issues, with some parishes and clergy splitting and forming their own organisation, resulting in disputes over church property and much bad feeling.
Police say 3 men burst into a home with knives during a children's birthday party in Norwich. They threatened the people there and demanded drugs. Thomas Mason has more details.
Officers were called to the property in North Norwich just before 7 o'clock yesterday evening. No one was hurt, but a mobile phone was stolen. The men were all black, wearing dark clothes and balaclavas. Norwich police think the men may have gone to the wrong address in what was meant to be a targeted attack. They acknowledged how distressing this must have been for the children, whose birthday party was disturbed. An officer sought to reassure local residents, saying they were doing everything they could to find the offenders quickly. Police believe the incident was related to so-called county lines drug dealing, where dealers use children to traffic drugs into rural areas from London.
Sport now, and Liverpool have increased their lead at the top of the Premier League, and Southampton have moved out of the bottom 3. With a full roundup of the day's action, here's Nicola McCarthy.
Liverpool have re-established a 7-point lead at the top of the Premier League after a hard-fought 1-0 win at Brighton.
Mo Salah waits, hands on hips. He runs forward now, and Mo Salah powers the penalty past button.
Liverpool manager Jurgen Klopp called it their most mature performance of the season, but added that their lead means nothing at this stage of the season. And it seems that attitude towards a First League title since 1990 is shared by the players. Here's captain Jordan Henderson.
The manager won't let us trust us. The manager will just be keeping on concentrating on the next game.
We know how important the next game is, another tough game next week. So, yeah, it's all about the next one, and that's all the focus is on. We've got another week to prepare for it. But today was another big 3 points for us, and then we look forward to the next game.
Chelsea beat Newcastle 2-1 at Stamford Bridge to move to within a point of third-place Spurs. Pedro gave Chelsea the lead after just 9 minutes. Manager Maurizio Sarri says that gave them a false sense of security.
After the goal, we thought that today is very easy. It wasn't very easy. We slept for 25 minutes, and so we were in trouble at the end of the first half. Better in the second half. I know very well that we can do, and we have to do better.
Meanwhile, Newcastle slip into the relegation zone above Fulham, who lost at Burnley, and Huddersfield Town, who stay bottom after a goalless draw at Cardiff. Huddersfield were given a penalty 14 minutes from time, only for referee Lee Mason to change his mind after consulting his assistant. Huddersfield manager David Wagner is adamant it should have stood.
When we had this golden opportunity to put the ball in the back of the net with this penalty decision for whatever reason, and I can't explain it. I even more can't explain it after I've seen the video footage. I think this was not a 100 to 1000% penalty, clear holding in this situation.
Not surprisingly, the Cardiff manager Neil Warnock saw things differently.
He's so experienced, is that linesman, and he could have seen. We've seen the angle from his view, and it's not a penalty from his view. There's not enough contact, so thankfully the referee listened to him.
There were boos at the final whistle at the King Power Stadium, where Leicester lost 2-1 at home to Southampton, who played the entire second half with 10 men. So is the Leicester manager Claude Puel feeling the pressure?
No comments. It's not my concern. No my concern.
It's not your concern, so you're not worried then?
No, not my concern. I just to focus and concentration in my team. It's the most important thing. I want to work with this player and to continue to move. Sometimes it's a good feeling, sometimes it's a bad result. It's like it's a football.
West Ham beat Arsenal 1-0 in the London derby to move into 9th. 19-year-old Declan Rice scored the game's only goal, his first for the club.
I think that was my 55th game today. And all the lads always saying, come on, shoot, you've got a great left foot, right foot. And today, I did. I just thought, why not? It's gone in the top corner, and I think you can see from the lads running over how much it meant to them as well for me to score. I can't put it into words, to be honest. You can see it on my face, just delighted.
In the day's other game, Watford won 2-1 at Crystal Palace. Rugby union, and there was an historic win for Edinburgh as they edged closer to the quarter-finals of the Champions Cup. Richard Cockerill's side won 28-17 at Toulon, only the third time the French side have lost at home in European competition.
We just got to make sure we don't get ahead of ourselves, but to come here and win is big for us, or big for any team. Saracens have won here. Newcastle probably took them by surprise, but they knew who was coming. They knew what was coming. And we were too good for them tonight, which is credit to us.
Potentially some good news for England coach Eddie Jones ahead of the Six Nations. Centre Jonathan Joseph could return for Bath next weekend after 9 months out injured. Bath won in the Champions Cup along with Leinster, Ulster and Scarlets. Newcastle can't now progress after losing in Montpellier. Golf and English golfer Charlie Hull has claimed her second title on the Ladies European Tour. She won by one shot in Abu Dhabi and says she's now excited for the year ahead.
I'm really happy with my win here in Abu Dhabi. I'm absolutely buzzing. It's a good way to start the season because it's the first event of the year, and I'm looking forward to this big year. Should be good.
India's cricket board has suspended 2 of its international stars, Hardik Pandya and KL Rahul, after comments they made about women on a television chat show. Pandya spoke about hookups with several women and said he liked to observe women at bars or nightclubs. Rahul was more reserved with his comments. The ban is with immediate effect, and the pair have been told to return home from India's tour of Australia to explain themselves. And in darts, the defending champion Glenn Durant beat Jim Williams 6-3 to reach the final of the BDO World Championship. He'll play 2-time winner Scott Waits, who had a comfortable 6-1 victory over Germany's Michael Unterbuchner.
Now for a look at the morning's front pages. There's a sense in the Sunday papers that political manoeuvring over Brexit is reaching fever pitch. The Sunday Times front page headline is "A Very British Coup." It warns that 2 groups of rebel MPs are threatening to upend the centuries-old relationship between the government and Parliament, allowing them to give themselves the power to put Brexit on hold or even overturn it by calling another referendum. The paper's political editor, Tim Shipman, says Theresa May only got wind of the plot when the government chief whip, Julian Smith, overheard one of the conspirators in the MP's cloakroom. The Observer says events will move fast if Theresa May loses the Commons vote on Tuesday. It reveals that Jeremy Corbyn is preparing to table an immediate vote of no confidence as early as that evening, and that Labour MPs will be forced to turn up in the Commons even if they're unwell. The Mail on Sunday says Number 10 is warning that Mrs May could be ousted as soon as Wednesday if her Brexit plan suffers a heavy defeat. The Sunday Telegraph believes the Tories are on the brink of imploding. It says that pro-EU MPs have claimed that a third of the cabinet would resign if Theresa May pursued a no-deal Brexit after her plan was defeated. In his cartoon, Matt pictures the charge of the Light Brigade. "This would be a very good moment for Plan B," is the caption. A Church of England bishop is to say the extent of child gambling is a generational scandal, according to the Sunday Express. Dr Alan Smith, the Bishop of St Albans, thinks that thousands of children have been turned into addicts after being targeted by betting ads, especially on the internet. The gambling industry insists there are effective protections online. And the Sunday Telegraph says that giving elderly patients an extra meal every day halves their chances of dying in hospital. It reports on a scheme piloted by the NHS after experts warned that older patients were failing to consume enough nutrients while convalescing on the wards. Women have dominated the nominations for this year's Brit Music Awards. Anne-Marie, who made her name by singing on Clean Bandit's #1 single Rockabye, is shortlisted in 4 categories: for Best Female, Best Album, Best Single and Best Video. Dua Lipa also has 4 nominations. Our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson reports.
Leading the way with 4 nominations is Anne-Marie, including Album of the Year for her debut Speak Your Mind. Dua Lipa has double nominations in both the Best Single and Video categories, but isn't eligible for Best Female as her album was released too long ago. Jorja Ezra is recognised in 3 categories and is clear favourite to win Best Male. While at the age of 66, there is a first Brit nomination for Nile Rodgers. Chic are up for Best International Group.
The headlines again. Theresa May has warned that it would be an unforgivable breach of trust in democracy if MPs reject her Brexit deal on Tuesday. The union representing probation officers has welcomed proposals to abolish most jail sentences of less than 6 months in England and Wales, but said they won't work unless they're given more resources. President Trump has angrily rejected a report that the FBI began an investigation into whether he was working secretly for Russia. The President of South Africa has urged men to unite against what he called a major crisis of rape and sexual assault facing his country. BBC News.